This morning we're continuing in a series of messages that we started a few weeks ago. And we specifically this morning are talking about the need to honor the Trailblazers, to honor those who have gone before us. We're going to be concentrating on Hebrews chapter 11, not the entire chapter, not every Bible character mentioned in the chapter, but on three, and on their circumstances as reasons why we should give thanks. This is the third in our series that I've called 6 weeks of giving thanks. Too often we think of Thanksgiving as one Thursday in November. And if as a people, as a nation, we actually give thanks to God, that's very commendable, because so often these days when you hear people talking about giving thanks, they're thanking each other. They're thanking their circumstances. They're thanking their employer. They're thanking someone else. But you don't hear any reference to the real reason that the holiday was established, a day for the nation to pause and give thanks. We need to thank our trailblazers, the men and women of faith who have walked before us and have passed on this heritage, this understanding, this blessing that we have in knowing that there is a real relationship for us to have with God. We all have faith in something, or we have faith in someone. And I think you would agree with me that even those who do not believe in God still have faith in what God provides. He provides the air we breathe. Was there anyone who was fearful that somehow we would be choked out of our next breath of air? You just took it. You just inhaled it. You just exhaled it. And we take it for granted. We take for granted the rising of the sun. When you go to bed at night, you anticipate, even on a cloudy morning or a foggy morning like what we had this morning, you anticipate the light of the sun breaking through those obstacles and the beginning of a new day. We have faith in the seasons, springtime and harvest, summer and winter. And we know that our fall is moving into the winter season here in the UP, and so we prepare for that. So we have faith in what God provides, even if we as a whole, as a people, really don't have a close relationship and a close faith in the provider. But it's particularly hard to maintain faith when we've been let down. We've placed our faith in someone, and somehow they caused us some grief. We placed our faith in something, and somehow, some way, that thing that we believed, that institution that we believed, failed. So who hoped, honestly, who hoped at the beginning of the baseball season that this would be the year the Detroit Lions, or football season, this would be a year that the Detroit Lions would have a winning season? You look at the record and you realize that's probably not going to happen now. Let me ask you this. Is there anyone here who had faith or hoped that this year's election process would be different and it would be civil? No. We know about the attack ads. We know about the things that are said and some of the untruths that are spoken in order for one party or one candidate to get their way over another party or another candidate. I need to also remind you that some people put faith in things that are not of God. Tomorrow's Halloween. And before we get all cranked up about the celebration of evil and death, I want us to recall the origin, the beginnings of the holiday of Halloween. The word Halloween is a condensed version of All Hallows Eve. Halloween, on October 31st, is the day before All Saints' Day on November 1st. And so Halloween, like Christmas Eve, is the day before a holy day. Now, the Roman Catholic Church set that day aside to remember those who were sainted by the church. But way back in the 4th century, before what we know as today's Roman Catholic Church was fully established, the early Christians, the early church, held feasts during the month of November to remember Christians who had been martyred, Christians who had been killed. They weren't too far removed from that happening. It was their ancestors who were burned at the stake. It was their ancestors who were fed to the lions. It was their ancestors who were crucified along the Roman roads. It was their ancestors who saw their families completely torn apart because of their refusal to deny Jesus Christ. They were martyred for their faith. And even in the 4th century, the early church was remembering that. But I need to tell you something. I need to tell you that precedent of honoring those who were people of faith before us was set long before the 4th century, and it was set long before the Roman Catholic Church declared November 1st as All Saints' Day. No, we see in Hebrews chapter 11 that the Hebrew writer reminded us of men and women of faith by giving us a list of some of those heroes, some of those ones who put their very lives on the line, and some who paid with their lives because they believed God. And so Hebrews chapter 11 paints a picture for us of the trailblazers of our faith. These are the ones who passed it on to the next generation and made everything fit so that the fullness of time would come and Christ would redeem the world. Against all human odds, these trailblazers committed themselves to the only one who could see them through. They didn't commit themselves to their friends or to their work or to their interests or to their human government. They committed themselves to God. And we need to do the same. We really need to do the same. We can give thanks for the examples of these trailblazers, and we find some of them, the big ones, listed in Hebrews 11. We can give thanks for them and for their examples because of 3 things. First of all, we give thanks because faith was the basis of their hope. Let's take a look at Hebrews chapter 11. And at the very beginning, we have an introduction before the names are listed. We are not only given an introduction, we are given a definition. And this is a definition of faith according to the Bible. Hebrews 11, verses 1 through 3. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for, the forefathers. Now, remember, this letter was written to Hebrew Christians, and so because this list is full of Old Testament heroes, it was personal to them because that was their heritage, that was their faith before they came to Christ, and they were commended for it. Verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made by what was visible. This is stated at the very beginning of the passage. Faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. Faith. Faith is the evidence of things we do not see. And because of their strong faith, these spiritual ancestors of ours from Old Testament times received a good report from God. God commended them. God congratulated them. God said, well done, good and faithful servants. It is only through faith that we really understand anything in this world. The world was framed by God. And none of the universe was created by happen chance. It didn't just kind of bump into each other and suddenly there was an amoeba. No, there was structure, there was plan. We see God at work in everything. Everything we see, and even the things that are being discovered these days by our human space exploration, speak to a master plan. Faith, something we believe in even if we can't see it. Now, the other day, I came across my uncle's watch. And except for him buying occasionally a new car, I would say that my uncle's watch that I came across was probably the most expensive personal item he ever bought. It wasn't a cheap watch. There's gold in that watch. And in 1971, my Uncle Bob was wearing that watch when he died while driving his car. The car crashed. The driver's door was torn off. My uncle was ejected from the car, and his watch, this watch, was flung off his wrist. Now, the next day, my dad and his brothers, my uncles, came to visit me in the hospital because I was a passenger in that car. I was trapped in that car after it did a 360-degree roll and landed in a dry concrete culvert along Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania. And I was recovering. I had some contusions. I had a skull fracture, and yes, that's what happened to me. That's why I'm the way I am. But after visiting me and checking in with me, and really the doctors waited until my dad and my uncles got there before I even found out that my Uncle Bob had died. After they broke the news to me, my uncles went back to the crash site. My dad stayed with me. And they looked around to see what else might be there because the door was flung open, the trunk popped up, the whole front was smashed, the roof was caved in, I was cocooned. But for the grace of God, I was saved. And as they went back to that culvert and started searching, they found this watch, my uncle's watch, that was flung off his wrist when he was thrown out of the vehicle, yards and yards away from where the crash had happened. So they picked it up, and they cleaned it off. And when I got home, I insisted on going to my uncle's funeral, even though I was recovering. And my other uncles came to me at the funeral home, said, "We want you to have Bob's watch." Very touching, yes. But I want to tell you something that's amazing. You might not think it's amazing, but it amazed me just this week. Just this week. This is a self-winding watch, which means that when it moves on your wrist, it is automatically winding itself. That's ingenious. There's no batteries involved. There's nothing else going on. It's all mechanical, and it winds itself. And I wore this watch for a number of years. But eventually I set it aside because I like the newfangled things. I like the idea of battery-powered watches, which I found out if you didn't change the battery soon enough would corrode inside the watch, and the watch was trash. And so Uncle Bob's watch, this watch, was placed in a watch box, and that watch box was placed in a basket. And that basket eventually went to our garage. After over 2 decades, 20 years of being stored in that basket, I, this week, found this watch. I shook it, and it's ticking. Not only is it ticking, it's ticking fast. It says it's 10 till, and the clock there says 18 till. So that means if I wear this watch, I preach shorter. That's probably one reason I took it off, because it was speeding up. But it amazes me that that second hand started sweeping across the dial again. Now, did this happen by chance? Did the fact that this watch could still run decades after anyone attempted to start it up, was that just something that occurred. And yet there are people who say that what we have in this world is just happen chance. It just so happened that everything came together. No, what we have in the world and what I'm holding in my hand is evidence of a master maker with a design in mind. That's who God is. That's what he does. You see, faith is the basis of our hope. It's important to know that also in Hebrews chapter 11, down in verse 6, it says, without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Faith is real because God is real. Faith is reliable because God is reliable. We believe in the things we do not see because we know the one who created them. And so let's understand that faith is the basis of our hope. And that's the story of creation, as mentioned in Hebrews 11. But then in verse 7, we go to the second thought of this, and that not only is faith our basis for hope, faith is unseen. Going down to verse 11, it says, by faith Noah, when warned about the things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. He didn't see it. He couldn't imagine what was about to happen. But God told him it was about to take place, and Noah prepared as God instructed him. Noah had no idea what it was going to be like once the rains began, or once the fountains of the deep burst open to start flooding the earth. And sometimes people think, 40 days of rain, day and night. Read it again, and you'll find that water stored underground also broke open to hasten the flood. He had no idea of this destructive power the Lord would use through something that is essential to life itself. Water. Water. Did you have a cup of coffee this morning? You had water. Did you eat anything this morning? Likely it was made with water somewhere along the way. So how much faith would it take for a man as old as Noah to build an ark 450 feet long when he lived in the desert? How much faith would it take when the Bible tells us up to that point in world history, it had never rained? There was enough moisture from the morning dew. Anyone have to kind of wipe their windshield this morning? We had a pretty good dew with that fog. But there was enough moisture every morning to water the earth. No one had ever seen it storm. And yet here is Noah saying, there's going to be a flood. And the people around him are saying, what's a flood? And yet, as they probably mocked him and ridiculed him and his sons for the years of work they did on that boat, how can you maintain your faith when everyone around you is laughing at you? Not with you, but at you. That's what Noah had to face. Now, I used to do a lot of repairs on my own vehicles. Kalita certainly remembers times when the vehicle was up on jacks and blocks, and she was concerned because I was crawling underneath it, fixing some things that I knew I could fix. But recently, getting my truck back on the road cost me more than $2,000 partly because of my age and because of my aches and pains, and a lot because I didn't have the time. I paid a competent mechanic to do the repairs. And while I have done some home renovations over the years and have done some things on our own house here in the Sioux, this summer I was not about to rebuild our front porch because it was in danger of collapsing. I had to entrust the repairs to a reputable contractor here in our community to tackle that job. You see, I can struggle with faith that is seen. I know the outcome. I know what's wrong. I can figure out. I can diagnose. I can envision. I can build. I can repair. But Noah had faith in what he could not even imagine, nor could anyone else in his day and age imagine it. Why did he have that kind of faith? The Bible says because he had faith in God. God said it, and it was credited to Noah as righteousness because he obeyed it. And so, not only is faith the basis of our hope, but faith is unseen. And finally, we scoot down to verse 24, and we find out that faith is something we acquire. It's not something we're born with, it's something we learn. Chapter 11, verse 24, a little longer passage because of the faith of this man. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. There we are. Faith is believing something we can't see. Verse 28. By faith, Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the death angel, the destroyer of the firstborn, would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. When the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell, and the people had marched around after the people had marched around them for 70 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And then the Hebrew writer says, I can't tell you about the rest of these heroes and what they gave up. And he mentions them, men and women alike. And he says, some of them paid with their lives, but they did not give up on their faith, because faith is acquired. Moses had no lapse of faith when it came to reaching that enormous body of water that stood between his people and the land God had promised to them. They were on their way out of Egypt. They were leaving with God's blessing. They were being asked to leave, begged to leave by Egypt because of the plagues. And up until they reached the waters of the great Red Sea, up until the point where Moses parted those waters, there had to be those who doubted how they would safely cross it. Wait a minute, Moses, we know where we're going. As a mass of over 1 million, we know we're heading to a body of water we can't cross. Are you going to send us here so that the Egyptian army can slaughter us in this open country where there's no protection? No. It was by faith that Moses listened to God and raised his hands with that staff, and the waters parted, and the Israelites crossed. And then once the last lingering Israelite got safely to the other side of the Red Sea, Moses lowered his arms, and the sea collapsed on the pursuing army of Egypt. So even with God's miracles of plagues, and even with the parting of the Red Sea, it wasn't long before Israel put their trust and their faith in things. Moses had gone up to Mount Sinai to receive the commands of God. And while he was there, the people said, he hasn't come back, he's died. Let's make a god to worship. And so a golden calf was fashioned from the gold that was given to them by the Egyptians. And they went back to the pagan attitudes and practices of Egypt. And because they put their faith in things that were created, rather than their faith in the one who created them, these adults who crossed the Red Sea lost their opportunity to put one foot into the promised land. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until they died. That's the story. And the story is about unseen faith. It's about acquired faith. If faith was natural, and if faith required no work on our part, everyone in the world would be saved. Everyone in the world would be in church. Everyone in the world would be praising God, but we know that's not the case. We must first identify what is worth believing in, and then we need to build on that faith, and we must make that our foundation. Faith is acquired. The stories of these men and women in Hebrews chapter 11 remind us that they had a strong faith. They endured. But that kind of faith is not natural. Faith is required. But in order for faith to be required, faith must be acquired in our lives and in our hearts. Why? Because human nature does not change. Faith has always been misdirected. Faith has always focused on people or on things that cannot satisfy. And in our world that is increasingly growing dark and full of despair, it's time for us to be today's trailblazers. God calls on us to be men and women of faith, to point people to God, to practice and live our thanks. Without faith, it's impossible to please God, the Creator, the craftsman, the designer, the one who has a purpose. That's who He is, and that's why we follow Him. Would you make sure that as you consider reasons for thanks, that you would increase your faith? And you would recognize the very power and presence of God, not just in this world, but the power and the presence and the design of God in your own life. It comes to us because of Jesus and through Him. And we will follow. We ask you to do that. Would you respond in faith and obedience? Would you show your faith by what you do and how you live? Would you belong to Christ and realize He has a plan and a design for you? You can make that decision today by coming to Christ, by being baptized, by letting His Spirit lead you and guide you and live in you, and by belonging to His body, the church. We invite you only because Jesus does, to come to the master designer and to rejoice. Let's stand together, and if you're ready to make that kind of decision, if you need to trailblaze in your own life, take the first step and come forward this morning.